I am here to talk about Iran-Iraq relations, and I want to first begin by saying that that is a big subject, and we're going to have an hour to talk, me talking to you. I'm going to try to keep the information as easy to swallow as possible. And I also want to just mention that these two countries have very similar sounding names, and that makes it even more challenging. So if at some point you're confused, feel comfortable to ask a quick clarification. I'm also going to start very in the past, but I promise, if you trust me, I'll get us to the present, which is what I think a lot of people want to know about. So before a 1-hour lecture, I want to give you a sense of what I want you to take away from the 1-hour lecture. So what I want you guys to appreciate by the end of it is just how intimately connected the two histories of Iran and Iraq are, beginning in the ancient period, but especially in the modern age. Beginning in the pre-modern period, the Persian Empire and Mesopotamia, which is what Iraq was before the modern nation of Iraq was founded, were considered very much part of the same community. The capital of the Sasanian Empire, which starts in the 220s, the Persian Empire, was Baghdad, contemporary Baghdad. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll enter the medieval period, briefly talk about that, and then delve into the modern age. So, first, Sasanians. Who are they? So the Sasanian Empire starts in the 220s. And actually, let me grab my notebook so that I don't start talking too much about tangential things. So the Sasanian Empire starts in the 220s. And like I said, the capital of the Sasanian Empire was in Ctesiphon, which is contemporary Baghdad. I don't know how pixelated that image is, but I promise you it's in that picture. Let me see if I can point it out to everybody. Right there is contemporary Baghdad. And the Sasanian Empire will continue to exist until the emergence of Islam. And Islam will be founded by an Arab in Saudi Arabia, and I'm going to do a brief primer on the early founding of the Islamic community because it will become very important later on to our story. The Prophet of Islam first experiences revelation in the early 600s. When he dies in the 630s, he doesn't have a successor laid out in front of him. He dies with that question up in the air. And the two people who are considered very seriously to take that position after him are his father-in-law and very close companion, a man named Abu Bakr. And this is the father of his favorite wife. And the other person is his son-in-law and cousin, Ali. Now, Abu Bakr finally gets it, but the people who believe that Ali should have taken that first position as the first successor are called Shi'is, and the people who believe that Abu Bakr should have been the first caliph are Sunnis. Now, until much later, everybody is Sunni. So this is not so significant for right now, but this is where the crisis begins between Shi'is and Sunnis. And this is important because today, the two majority Shi'i countries in the Middle East are Iran and Iraq. As you can see on that map, the demographics. So what you see in yellow is Sunni, and then what you see in green is Shi'i. Now, some of the most important sites for Shi'is are in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. And that's also important. Again, if you are a Shi'i empire, you will want territories in Iraq because important shrine cities are there. So Ali, the man who Shi'is believe should have been the first caliph after the Prophet Muhammad dies, is killed in a city in Iraq, Kufa, his grandson is killed in a city in Iraq, Karbala. And these become very important Shi'i centers, even though, like I said, Iraq and Persia will not be Shi'i at this point. So, after the first 4 caliphs, we have the Great Umayyad dynasty. And they stretch from Iberia, from Europe, to the Middle East, uniting a huge swath of territory. And this is really, really important to the story of Islam, because at this point we have Arab Muslims ruling over a huge population of non-Arab Muslims. And there's a big question mark about what to do with all these people. How are we going to govern them? What status will they have in this empire? And the added question of people converting to Islam. How do we deal with them? Does anyone know what language the Quran is written in? Arabic, very good. You're not really supposed to translate it because you lose the meaning in the translation. And so lots of people who don't know Arabic are converting to Islam. And the Umayyads are wondering, are you really Muslim if you can't read the Quran? Are you really Muslim if you don't understand what the Prophet was saying? Should you be subject to the non-Muslim tax, or should you be subject to the Muslim tax? Now add to that a layer of resentment and frustration, because many Persians were used to having an elite position, a privileged position in society, which they've lost because the new elite class are predominantly Arab. And they're very uncomfortable with incorporating non-Arab, non-Muslim populations. Persians at this point are mostly Zoroastrian. And the conversion process takes many centuries to fully take place. Now, this debate about whether or not you can be fully Persian and Muslim, whether or not a Persian can really be incorporated into Umayyad politics and bureaucracy, causes many Persians to feel very alienated from Umayyad society. And so what they will do, instead of working really hard to convince Arabs to accept them into their politics, is support another faction. So Persians support another political faction who are the descendants of the Prophet's uncle Abbas. And this is the next great dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty. And when we think of like the golden age of Islamic civilization, this is it, the Abbasid dynasty. Incredible literature, incredible science, incredible arts. The Persians at this point, again, are not Shi'i, but for centuries, they have had kingship passed down through hereditary means. So the idea that the best person who deserves the job would get the job didn't really make sense. And they wanted to throw their weight behind the people who were most related to the Prophet. They're Muslim now. Why shouldn't the family of the founder of the religion rule politically over Muslims? So the Abbasid dynasty gets the support of Persians. And what do when they get power? They move the capital from Damascus to Baghdad. And they move it as a tip of the hat to the Persian community. Okay, we're conceding something culturally. And again, we see an indication that Mesopotamia still at this point is considered a kind of heartland of the Persian Empire, Persian culture, Persian tradition, Persian civilization. Now, I'm going to move us beyond this period and jump us to another period. The Abbasid Caliphate ends in the mid-13th century. And the Abbasids, when they take over, invite a very large population of Turks into the Middle East. Turks are essentially East Asians. They become first the military fighting force and eventually will become the elite, the political elite in the region. And one very important Turkish dynasty is the Ottoman dynasty. And I think now we're entering more familiar zone for people. So the Ottoman Caliphate is a very important one. It begins in 1299 and it ends in 1922. This is a very long-lasting dynasty, beginning in the medieval period and ending in the modern age. Now, the Ottoman Empire is a Sunni empire, and that's very important. When, at this point, Persia is being reconstituted into what we call the Safavid dynasty. The Safavids start out as a Sunni group. As they start taking territory, and as they start trying to reconstitute this old Persian empire, they decide, how do we make ourselves different from the Ottomans? We're all Turkish speaking, we're all Muslim, like what's gonna make us stand out? How are we gonna inspire people to come on our side? We'll convert to Shiism. So at this moment, Iran becomes Shi'i. In 1501, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, who's a very young boy, he's like 12, 13 years old, Ishmael, decides to convert himself and his soldiers into Shiism. And at this point, we have the long process of getting the rest of Iran to convert to Shiism. The Ottomans and Safavids are arch enemies. They're constantly competing with each other. And what does the Safavid dynasty want? They want Mesopotamia. And they want especially the areas that are most associated with Shiism, the great Shi'i shrines, especially the areas where Shi'i figures had been assassinated. Remember, I talked about Ali and Hussein. And so they're head-to-head with the Ottomans trying to get that land. And between the 1500s and the 1600s, there's lots of back and forth that I won't bother you with. Ultimately, the Safavids fail. They don't get it. And Mesopotamia remains in Ottoman hands. And that's very important because what that means is Mesopotamia essentially becomes and remains Arabized, whereas the Persian Empire is very different both culturally and demographically. Now, I had told you guys at the beginning of this presentation that Shiism is important because Iraq is also Shi'i. And some of you who know something about the Middle East might have thought, well, that makes sense because they're next door to Iran. So of course, that kind of exchange must have caused a lot of Iraqis to become Shi'i. That's not necessarily the case. After the Safavid dynasty collapses, a very important historical character emerges to basically salvage the ashes of the Safavid dynasty and maintain the territorial integrity of Iran. And that person is Nader Shah. And Nader Shah himself was quite agnostic. He didn't really believe too much of anything. But he especially thought the idea that Iran was Shi'i was very silly. Why is it that Iran should distinguish itself in such a profound way from the rest of the Islamic world, particularly when Europeans are becoming more and more powerful and causing more and more pressure to be exerted on Persia, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims in India, the Mughals. And so he proposes making Iran Sunni. Why not? They've only been Shi'i for about 200 years. Why can't they be Sunni again? Now, the Shi'i clerics in Iran become very anxious about this, and they think, maybe it's over. It's time to go. Let's go to those Shi'i shrine cities in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, where there is an infrastructure for Shi'ism, where Shi'ism is alive and well. And so many of them leave. That is a very important migration because what it means is lots of Iranian clerics end up in Iraq. But that's not yet what makes Iraq Shi'i. We're getting there, we're getting close, but it's not the reason. The reason Iraq becomes Shi'i is because of the Ottoman Reformation Project. And I want to start our story where I usually start my story with my students. And I have a couple students here, and some of this is like profoundly repeat information for them. This is where I usually start my classes. Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798, and this is a traumatic experience for the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, up until about 150 years earlier, were very comfortable. They weren't necessarily conquering Europe, but they knew that they could take Europeans if somehow they were to enter, invade their own territory. In 1798, Napoleon shows that within a couple of hours he can decimate the Ottoman military. And this is a shocking experience for everybody. And the Ottomans realize in order to defend their borders, they will have to modernize, which is what we call defensive modernization, meaning modernizing in order not to be a colony of Europe. And modernizing meant Europeanizing. And I can show you all kinds of great images about Europeanization in the 19th century. The wives of kings in ballerina tutus and tube socks, but I won't. I will exempt you from that experience. Boo! Yeah. But what's important here is that the military is being modernized, but also many of the sort of pre-modern lifestyles that we largely associate with tribalism are going to become eliminated. The Ottomans say, okay, we have to completely reassess the way that we have been conceiving of our subjects. Our subjects, up until now, have been able to operate independently as long as they were paying their taxes and they were, in general, respectful of the Islamic community, we're fine. By the mid-19th century, by the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire is starting to reconceive of its subjects as citizens. And citizens means that you have certain rights endowed by your state, but you also owe your state certain things. So, I, the state, owe you, let's say, basic education. You should be literate. I owe you a hospital. You might not be able to afford the hospital, but a hospital near you where you can get soap or you can get some kind of sanitation product. I owe you, as the state, police, so that your private property can be protected. But you also owe me something. In addition to taxes, you also owe me information about yourselves. Where do you live? How much money do you make? What kind of occupation do you have? How many kids do you have? How many wives do you have? You also owe me service in the military. You need to be drafted. This transforms the relationship between Ottoman subjects and their state. What this means is, previously tribal communities that had been traveling for centuries seasonally, now we're told you have to settle and you have to tell us what you're doing, where you're living, how much money you're making. And this causes an existential crisis for the Arab community all over the Ottoman Empire. The Iraqi Arabs, and I'm going to be talking now about Iraqis, not Mesopotamians, because we're getting closer to the 20th century to Iraq. Iraqi Arab Sunnis, who'd been nomadic for centuries, are now being told to settle. And this causes, like I said, a kind of crisis of faith. What are our traditions? What is meaningful? What are we preserving? What are our communities going to look like? And this offers an opportunity to Shi'i clerics to proselytize. At the same time that this is happening, Wahhabism is on the rise in Saudi Arabia. Wahhabism is a very literalist, scripturalist Islamic doctrine that is now dominant in Saudi Arabia. Wahhabis travel to Iraq, and they start very aggressively trying to eliminate some of the Shi'i shrines that are there. And the Shi'i clerics, in order to protect themselves, start to convert the Sunni tribes to Shi'ism. The Shi'i conversion, therefore, happens in the late 19th century. So it's the intersection of Shi'i clerics being very anxious about Sunnis going after them, and as a result, wanting to recruit Sunnis into Shi'ism. and the fact that Sunni tribes were going through this existential crisis, so they were drawn to something new to preserve their traditions. So in the late 19th century, Iraq becomes majority Shi'i, and that puts Iran and Iraq on a track toward each other because they're the only two majority Shi'i communities in the region. But remember I said that there are all these Iranian Shi'i clerics in Iraq because they traveled there. They were so anxious about Iran suddenly becoming Sunni that they'd moved to Iraq. Well, they're still there. Not only are they converting Arab Sunnis into Shi'ism, but they're also very active in Iranian politics. Now, in the imperial period, that's fine. I mean, you can be active in someone else's politics and have one foot in one door, one foot in the other door. But in the modern period, this is a problem because the question becomes, are you a citizen of Iran or of Iraq? And if you're a citizen of Iraq, then you can't be active in Iranian politics. That doesn't make sense. You either are loyal to this country or that. And if you're active in Iranian politics, then you need to go back to Iran. And so in the early 20th century, you see a wave of deportations of Iranians because of their activities in Iran. But this takes time. It's not overnight. The Ottoman Empire collapses because of World War I. Their 150-year effort to reform their empire does not succeed. They eventually will be split up into different countries by Europeans. These borders do not come out of nowhere. This is a sort of, this is something that we often say in the West, that it's an empty map and we just drew the borders at random. That's not true. These borders did resonate with indigenous people. They participated in the drawing of those borders. But Iraq is an example of that kind of wholesale production. Iraq is a very diverse country, and as a result posed certain challenges to the monarchy that took over Iraq. In 1920, the British, who were in charge of the Iraq Mandate. Mandate means a country that didn't yet exist, now exists, and needs a European country to shepherd them into modernity. So Britain is responsible for Iraq. And Britain installs King Faisal in Iraq as the king. Now, King Faisal is a Hashemite monarch, and if that sounds familiar, it's because the king of Jordan is also a Hashemite monarch. The Hashemite monarchy came out of Saudi Arabia. The British basically put two Saudi brothers in charge of Jordan and Iraq. In fact, the king of Iraq, Faisal, who you see looking very dignified in that photograph, was originally placed in Syria, didn't take, so they moved him to Iraq. Faisal understood that there were certain challenges inherent to governing Iraq because of its majority Shi'i population, and also because next door is a majority Shi'i country that would love to have more influence because of the vast number of important Shi'i shrines in Iraq. I want to mention, at around the same time, we have the birth of the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. This is very famous, of course. Reza Shah takes over in 1925. His son will take over after him, and the dynasty will collapse dramatically in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Now, Iran and Iraq, at the same time, are modernizing. Their dynasties are being formed at the same time as well. And Iran, like Iraq, is struggling with citizenship laws. Who belongs where? How do you decide who belongs where? There's been so much migration in the late 19th century that this question is sort of up in the air. And when Iraq passes its first nationality law in 1924, this really comes to a head between the two. So Iraq defines citizens as someone who had habitual residence in Iraq since 1921. And you can imagine that that would include a whole lot of Iranians. Just to give you a sense of what I mean, the city of Karbala, which is where the grandson of the Prophet was assassinated, executed really, at this point is about 75% Iranian. That's huge. By 1957, so within 35 years, it would be 12% Iranian. So these nationality laws had a tremendous impact on who was living where. Now, the other obvious issue that they were trying to manage was the fact that Iran, at this same period, was trying to argue that because so many Iranians lived in these shrine cities, they really should be in Iranian jurisdiction, because the people there are Iranian citizens, so they're not beholden to Iraqi law. Why should it be an Iraqi city? The nationality law of 1924 also created a kind of subcategory where you could be an Iraqi citizen or an Iraqi resident, but not a citizen. And this was very significant. So you could live in Iraq, but have Iranian citizenship. Why would you do that? What kind of a person would decide, I'm going to stay in a place but not have citizenship? That seems silly. The reason you would do that is because you would not be drafted, and your children would not be drafted. And for anyone who's Iranian here, they'll know that people do all kinds of crazy things to get out of the draft in Iran. The same thing goes in Iraq. So the lure of not being drafted was significant enough that lots of people would apply for Iranian citizenship while living in Iraq. Now, this was really unappealing for the Iranian government. The theory in the early 20th century, and this would actually be somewhat foreign to Europeans, because the European sense of population was the fear of overpopulation, that if we overpopulate, then we'll have not enough resources and we'll be competing and there'll be war. That's not the case in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the fear was underpopulation. There is an intense focus on birth rate, on having more children, on getting married, on having more citizens. And Iran is mortified by this nationality law specifically because they would lose so many Iranian citizens to Iraq. So there's a big fight between the two countries on this issue. Now, some of you might be wondering, I know a little bit about Iran since I'm at Iran Culture Week. And I know that one thing that defines Iranian nationalism is the fact that Iranian nationalism is very focused on Persian culture, which is a particular ethnicity in Iran. Now, Iraqi nationalism was very focused on Arab culture. And Shi'is were really not considered part of that Arab community. Sunni culture, Sunni faith, was enormously privileged in the early 20th century, especially because the dominant political ideology in the early 20th century for the Arab world was pan-Arabism, which means the erasure of national borders and the uniting of all Arabs under one flag or one banner. And Persians, having a large Shi'i population that are potentially Persian, would make this rather challenging, nearly impossible, and would certainly make Iraq not really in the running for leading such a movement because they have this large, potentially non-Arab population. Now that said, a vanishing minority of Shi'is in Iraq are Persian. This was largely a kind of hysteria that was nurtured by pan-Arabists. In the 1960s, they would say 10% of Iraq was Persian. That was crazy. Of course, it wasn't. But there was a kind of specter of Iranian influence by having Iranian citizens infiltrating the government. You can see the demographics on that map, with the south being predominantly Shi'i. The north is Kurdish. This is another problem for Iraq. If you're going to be a pan-Arab country, you can't have a 20% population of Kurds. I like this quote because it's very amusing. This is, Sathi al-Husri was one of the founding fathers of Iraq, another founding father who wasn't actually from Iraq, like the king of Iraq, not really from Iraq. He was the head of the Department of Education. He was absolutely exercised by the concept that Persians were infiltrating bureaucracy and politics, and they were presenting as just Arab Shi'is when in fact they were really Persian. And he used to say that one way that you could determine if someone was Persian was by the way they looked. And his description of Persians is hugely amusing to anyone who's ever seen a Persian, which is that they have red hair and blue eyes. He was eventually expelled from government because he led a big campaign to fire very important Shi'i members of the Ministry of Education. And King Faisal, in his wisdom, realized it was a very bad idea to alienate 60% of your population, so he eventually dismissed him. But it was very important for the Ministry of Education because he wrote the textbooks. And so there was a huge anti-Shi'i slant in much of the Iraqi textbooks, and a lot of suspicion against Iraqi Shi'is as potential Persians. Now, the rub of it is really actually the border dispute. Iran had for centuries been arguing to incorporate more of Iraq into its borders. This was the primary problem that Iran was facing for the last 300 years in its confrontations with the Ottoman Empire. After the establishment of the nations Iran and Iraq in their modern form, the dispute was about specifically a waterway. And that waterway you can see right here at the bottom, right by the Gulf, the Shatt al-Arab. And in 1937, the Pahlavi dynasty and the Hashemite monarchy agreed to allow a favorable border to Iraq. And this is something that really bothered the Pahlavi dynasty. Why did we agree to this? And at the same time, the Pan-Arabists in Iraq were saying, why is it that the province neighboring Iraq, right here, which is Khuzestan, is in Iranian borders, considering the fact that the majority of the population is Arab? And if Iranian nationalism is going to be antagonistic toward Arabs, then what right does it have to rule over Arabs? The real issue here is that all of Iran's oil is there. And so, of course, there is a desire, once oil is discovered, to exercise some influence over an area that's Arab populated. Very crucially, in 1968, Saddam Hussein takes over Iraq. And the Pahlavi dynasty, Mohammad Reza Shah, who you see pictured there on the right, is very ecstatic because that means that Iraq is weak. And so he starts to fund Kurdish rebels, which makes Iraq very weak. And it brings Saddam Hussein to the table to sign a more favorable treaty. So in 1975, Saddam Hussein and the Shah meet on that happy occasion to sign the Algiers Agreement, which allowed Iran a more favorable boundary at the Shatt al-Arab. And this is something that Saddam Hussein will learn when the Iranian Revolution happens. He'll say, aha, now you're weak, and I can invade you and try to get some of your land the way you did to us. Now, before I get there, we have to talk about the Islamic Revolution. Remember I had mentioned that, let's say, troublemaking clerics would end up in Iraq? Ayatollah Khomeini is one of those clerics who ended up in exile in Iraq for about 15 years. He was on the outs with the Pahlavi monarchy, so he gets sent to Iraq. Saddam Hussein, close to his execution, was asked, what was the greatest mistake you ever made as a political actor? He said, the greatest mistake I ever made was not killing Khomeini when I had the chance, when he was living in Iraq. This was a really critical time for the Pahlavi monarchy. The Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein's political party, recognized that Khomeini would be a potential vulnerability, a liability for the Shah. And so they kept him around. He was active. He eventually will go back to Iran and start the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And when he does, Saddam Hussein will say, excellent. I can take advantage of your weakness to invade. The Iran-Iraq War lasts from 1980 to 1988. This is a very long war. There are some sort of exaggerated estimates about the casualty rate. There has been a lot of study about how many people died. Very often the 1 million number is thrown around. It certainly was not 1 million people, but many, like hundreds of thousands of people died, probably between 350 and 500,000. Now, why does it start? Like I said, Saddam Hussein is thinking, there is an Arab community sitting on a pot of gold. If we can get them to side with us, then we can get that oil. Very easy strategy. Of course, when you invade a place, they're not necessarily super thrilled to see you destroy their homes, and this was a big problem for him. The invasion was very brutal and very violent. It did not succeed in turning Iranian Arabs, who were deeply marginalized from the Iranian community, to fight for Iraq. And at this point, after about a year of fighting, Saddam Hussein says, that didn't work out, we're going home. And it's here that the Islamic Republic decides, but there is a very large Shi'i community in Iraq. What if we went to Iraq and tried to co-opt them? So the war continues really as an Iranian effort to get Iraqi Shi'is to fight for them. And this fails. It's a miserable failure. And part of this is because Iraqi Shi'ism is really different from Iranian Shi'ism. And you guys have been listening to me drone on for just like a few minutes, and you already can probably tell the history is very different. They converted for different reasons. They speak different languages. They have different traditions. The Iraqi Shi'is converted to preserve Arabism, to preserve their nomadic traditions and hierarchies. They convert as an effort to fight against the modernization of the Ottoman Empire. Iranian Shi'is converted because a 12-year-old decided to be different than the Ottomans. Very different histories. They've had Shi'ism for much longer than Iraq has had Shi'ism, for about 300 years longer. So they have a much deeper connection to the faith and also a very different relationship to it, in addition to the fact that Arabs and Persians do not necessarily see their faiths in similar ways, even though they're both Shi'i. So ultimately, Iran was not able to co-opt the Shi'i community in Iraq. But lucky for Iran, the United States decides to invade Iraq in 2003. And this was a real exciting moment for the Islamic Republic because they could capitalize on the American enterprise in Iraq, and that enterprise was to spread democracy. The very critical decision made by the American government to completely get rid of anyone associated with Saddam Hussein's political party left the government open to Shi'is. So if you were someone who was in an underground Shi'i party for 30 years and you had extensive ties to Iran, because who was funding your Shi'i party? Iran. You were in a great position to take over government after America invaded. And so the very first prime ministers and presidents were people who were deeply connected to the Islamic Republic, people who had spent long periods of time in the Islamic Republic during the 1980s, people who had sided with Iran in the Iran-Iraq War were now becoming president of Iraq. So the final conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War was not positive for Iran, but the American intervention in Iraq ultimately gave Iran the win that it was hoping for in the Iran-Iraq War. Let me see if I have another slide. No, I don't. That's the conclusion.